Trump will arrive in Beijing tomorrow, at least that's what's reported, and he will depart after lunch on Friday, so it will be a brief meeting, but one can expect that it will be an intense meeting as well. The People's Republic of China has confirmed that it's going to happen. That's also news, because it was long unclear whether the two big heads of state would really come to meet in this spring. According to the official statement, they are going to have an in-depth exchange of views on major issues concerning China and the US relations and world peace and development. Now, that sounds like a mouthful. What exactly Trump and Xi are going to talk about, we don't know. But we have two experts in the room who will introduce you to what they think will be on the agenda and what the issues at stake are. Let me first introduce myself here. I am Claudia Wessling. I'm the Director of Communications and Publications, and will lead you through this very short meeting where you will get sufficient time to ask questions. Our two speakers, Helena Legarda, Head of Program Foreign Relations here at MERICS. So Helena is specializing in China's foreign policy, security policy, topics like Taiwan, China's outreach to the global south, so everything foreign policy related. And Jacob Gunter is here. He's our head of program economy and industry, and his title says what he is specializing in, that is China's economy and how it affects also us over here in Europe. Welcome to the two of you. Thanks that you took the time this morning. And that said, I would hand it over to Jacob.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. So looking at this sort of Trump-Xi summit, starting from kind of the 30,000-foot perspective, it's going to be a kind of a strange event in that the goals for both the Trump administration and Xi and the Politburo Standing Committee are going to be very different, which isn't insane. You can have a summit with very different goals. But if we think about it from the position of sort of what are the victory conditions of each side, they are quite distinct and in some ways kind of incompatible. And frankly, what the victory conditions that the Trump administration have set out seem sort of difficult to realize, if not impossible, whereas the ones that I think that the leadership in Beijing is going to be approaching this summit with are much more achievable. So from the perspective of the CCP leadership in Beijing, the main goal of the summit is going to be basically to stabilize the relationship with the United States, to prevent kind of escalation the way that we had after Liberation Day, and ultimately to find enough of a deal that buys Beijing the time that it needs to continue to advance its own goals domestically and internationally. What I mean by that is that from the CCP's perspective, time is on their side. They continuously talk about this. The West is in decline, the East is rising, this change is unseen in a century. All of this language, they authentically mean this. And to a certain extent, they are correct. To achieve the kind of technological, industrial, economic self-reliance, to modernize the military, to modernize Chinese society, to do all of these things, it is a lot easier to achieve these if you don't have the United States engaged in a trade or a technology war with you. So that will be kind of the goal from Xi Jinping's perspective, is find a deal that doesn't cost China too much, that ensures that China is treated sort of as an equal amongst the US, but ultimately that one that buys time. And buying a year or two of no more trade conflict with the United States is a meaningful amount of time to progress on these other goals. From Trump's perspective, I mean, look, what he says changes from day to day, but ultimately I think we can kind of understand the Trump administration's understanding of the relationship with China economically is primarily we have a trade deficit and that's bad, and we need to make sure that we can access China-made rare earths and other materials. at least until U.S. diversifications succeed, and ultimately trying to secure a deal ahead of the midterm elections to bolster voter sentiment. Both sides do have an interest in making sure that there's a stabilization in the relationship. I think it's evident that the speed and intensity of escalation after Liberation Day was unsustainable because both sides immediately tried to de-escalate. And neither side, I think, wants to go back to that. But both sides have the capacity to basically demolish each other's economies. So this is a high-stakes game where both sides have the ability to really ratchet up the leverage, but neither side, I think, wants to do that. How do we tactically achieve the kind of results that each side is looking for? From China's perspective, coming up with some sort of deal that is similar to the Phase 1 deal is probably their primary set of tactics. The Phase 1 deal was a complete failure, in large part because of the pandemic. The Phase 1 deal was agreed to right as COVID was blowing up. So it wasn't really possible for China to do some of the purchasing, to realize some of the purchasing commitments that it had agreed to. But the kind of purchasing agreements of the Phase 1 deal, saying we will buy more soybeans, more agriculture, more energy, LNG, things like this, more commodities from the United States. I think that's a pretty easy choice for Beijing. It doesn't cost that much. They kind of need these things anyway. And a small amount, it's a relatively small amount of money in order to buy this really critical time that China needs. They also will probably offer some market access commitments for the Americans. Those may or may not materialize. They may or may not matter. China's probably about as open as it's going to be. It can remove market access barriers that are direct and then keep some behind kind of secondary barriers. But they may also even try to argue, and if I'm in Xi Jinping's shoes, I'm going to try to argue that the United States should lessen some of its export controls so that China can buy more American goods. I don't think the national security folks in DC are going to go forward with that. But if you're dealing with Donald Trump, who is first and foremost concerned about this deficit, these are the kind of arguments that I'd be looking for. When it comes to the American side, basically to structurally change things in such a way that the trade deficit is lessened between the US and China would basically require China to reverse all of the changes that Xi Jinping has made to the economic model of the country. It would require major structural reforms that are antithetical to how Xi Jinping and the senior leadership in Beijing view the economy and the economic model that they've built. It's the amount of investment into industry and technology that continues in the current model in China, compared with the lack of support for boosting household incomes. This is a feature, not a bug, of that system. And frankly, Chinese consumers just can't really consume that many more American goods if they have stagnant income growth, if they don't have the resources available, if everything is prioritized towards industry and the supply side of the economy. Other than kind of buying some commodities through SOEs, it's difficult to imagine Chinese consumers suddenly after a trade deal will be really, really keen to buy a lot of American goods in a way that will structurally change the deficit. As a last point, before I conclude, the Board of Trade concept that has been floated. I think it's possible that you could have a Board of Trade that exists on paper and meets and talks about these things. Other than for government procurement purposes and for sort of commodities purchases, it's hard to see how this actually works. Does a Board of Trade decide that there are certain American consumer goods that Chinese people really need to start consuming? Like, are they going to start, frankly, are Chinese SOEs going to start buying a bunch of bourbon whiskey from the United States and forcing it onto Chinese consumers? Like, it's hard to see how a Board of Trade works for things that are actually at the consumer level. Instead, it's going to be maybe marginal at the procurement side of things and the commodity side of things. In conclusion, all of this kind of underlies the core issue at stake, which is any economic deal that's imaginable for both sides to accept is going to be too limited to address the underlying issues driving the conflict. This will be a ceasefire. This will be a truce. This is not the end of the trade conflict between the United States and China. The trade conflict exists between these two countries because they have fundamental differences in their economic models that are getting wider and wider, let alone the geopolitics that Helena is about to cover. So we may see a little bit of a reprieve, but I wouldn't expect this to be the signal of the end of a long-term U.S.-China economic conflict. And with that note, I'll hand it over to Helena for the complexities of the geopolitical side of things, which makes this even more complicated to achieve a deal.
Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, so I think the first point to make is that we definitely expect the focus of the summit to be primarily on economic issues. As Jacob was talking about, those are the primary objective for the US side, and it's likely to take up much of the time and the attention during the summit. But as Jacob was saying, geopolitical dynamics will hang over the proceedings. The Iran war in particular, the war in the Middle East, and the ensuing oil crisis and energy crisis worldwide will play a role. It will come up, especially as the U.S. continues to sanction Chinese firms over their involvement in either the oil trade with Iran or because of their support for the IRGC. The expectation is that Trump will push Xi Jinping to pressure Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I think that's the most obvious kind of geopolitical point that will come up. But there's a few other, points of friction, like China's tensions with Taiwan or with Japan, or China's nuclear buildup that might also come up during their meetings. I'll make a point here that I think that Ukraine and the war in Ukraine is likely to be extremely marginal if it comes up at all. It is not something that seems to take up much space in Donald Trump's kind of mind when preparing for the summit, judging by statements either by himself or by other kind of administration officials. So I don't expect there will be much discussion over Ukraine and the role of Russia in the European theater. Of course, we might be proven wrong. Donald Trump could change his mind and this could come up, but it seems quite unlikely. But I think with all of these geopolitical points, we see a similar trend and a similar dynamic as with economic issues. The differences between China and the US in how they view these conflicts or these dynamics, these geopolitical events, are so structural that even if they get mentioned, the discussion is very likely to be little more than statements of position. There's been some discussion out there about the chances that Trump and Xi might reach some sort of a trade-off between new U.S. language on Taiwan and China would offer in exchange some pressure on Tehran, again, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I find that quite unlikely, mostly because I don't see very high chances that the U.S. will shift its position on Taiwan so majorly during this summit. I think there would also be quite substantial opposition back in DC and from other members of the Trump administration. So if we look at the victory conditions for geopolitical dynamics, again, what the US is looking for is a pretty fundamental shift in how China conducts its foreign policy and security policy. And that will just not happen. Beijing feels very vindicated at the moment in its foreign policy approach and its role in the world. And if anything, China sees opportunities right now. It sees the Trump administration's policies as creating quite a few openings for China to appear as the more responsible, quote unquote, global actor, and as being able to step into some of those gaps that the US is leaving internationally. So they don't see any need right now to change approach, to change how they engage in international conflicts, to change how they operate in the Indo-Pacific, much less to slow down or shift their approach to China's military modernization. When we look at Beijing's victory conditions for the summit in the geopolitical domain, I think Xi Jinping would obviously really like to hear Trump opposing Taiwan independence or expressing some support for some peaceful resolution of the conflict. But as I said, that's pretty unlikely. So I think realistically speaking and tactically for China, setting these geopolitical friction points aside will likely be considered enough of a victory for Xi Jinping. It will allow him to keep the meeting tone positive, keep the relationship stable. They will discuss, as I said, Iran. Xi might commit to helping achieve peaceful resolution of the war. I expect that Xi Jinping's 4-point peace proposal for the Middle East, the four sort of principles that he listed will be mentioned, but it's likely to go a little beyond that. In short, I think what we expect Beijing overall in the economic domain and the geopolitical domain to continue to do during the summit is to keep implementing its so far pretty successful Trump playbook, which involves skirting and avoiding conflictive matters as much as he can, and drawing the US into protracted but pretty positive sounding talks that produce ceasefires or limited deals, but kick the can down the road on the big structural issues as China buys time. And of course, if at any point this doesn't work and things look set to escalate, China does have some points of leverage, like the rare earth export controls that it can put on the table to restart this entire cycle and bring the US back into talks. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena and Jacob. And the way you describe it, it really looks as if those two heads of state are not looking at a relaxed, fun meeting with having lunch, but they will look at a wide array of issues on which the US and China do have fundamental differences. So whatever we can expect from this meeting, or what maybe both sides also expect, is to avoid further escalation and bet on small wins or small steps to make progress to just avoid both countries moving further towards escalation. And as you both described it, China seems to be in a slightly better position here, being able maybe to buy time and avoid these structural issues are tabled again and again in the bilateral relations.